When the olive green trucks rolled into the village of Saint-Rémy that autumn morning in 1944, Marie Dubois watched American soldiers hand her starving daughter a piece of chocolate, and for the first time in 4 years, she allowed herself to weep. But the road to that moment had been paved with unspeakable hunger, quiet desperation, and the slow erosion of everything she had once called normal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind in the Loire Valley carried the smell of rotting leaves and something else, something that had become all too familiar in the villages scattered across occupied France. It was the smell of absence. The absence of bread baking in morning ovens, the absence of meat sizzling in pans, the absence of life as it had been before the gray uniforms arrived. In the village of Saint-Rémy, a cluster of stone cottages huddled along a narrow road that wound between apple orchards now picked bare by requisition orders, the morning of October 1943 began like every other morning in the 4th year of occupation: cold, silent, hungry. Marie Dubois stood in line outside Monsieur Leclerc's bakery, her wool coat pulled tight against the chill, though the fabric had grown so thin it offered little protection. She was 32 years old, though the mirror now showed a woman a decade older. Her cheeks, once full and flushed with the health of a farm wife, had hollowed into sharp angles. Her hands, calloused from work, trembled slightly, not from cold alone, but from the persistent weakness that hunger carves into the body. Beside her stood her daughter Isabelle, 8 years old with eyes too large for her gaunt face. The child's hair, once a cascade of chestnut curls that caught sunlight like copper, now hung limp and dull, tied back with a frayed ribbon. Her brother, Thomas, 10 years old, pressed close to her mother's other side, his thin shoulders hunched beneath a jacket that belonged to his father. Their father, Henri Dubois, was gone, taken 18 months earlier by the Gestapo on suspicion of harboring resistance fighters in his barn. Marie had watched from the kitchen window as they dragged him into a truck, his protests silenced by the butt of a rifle. She had not seen him since. She did not speak of him anymore, not even in whispers. Speech required energy, and energy required food. The line shuffled forward with agonizing slowness. 30 women and children, their breath forming small clouds in the dawn air. Each clutching ration cards printed on cheap paper that promised portions measured in grams. The official allowance for an adult was 350 grams of bread per day, for a child 250. In theory, this was survival. In practice, it was starvation stretched across months. When Monsieur Leclerc finally opened the door, he did so without ceremony. There was no greeting, no smile. His face had become a mask of exhaustion, carved by the impossible task of making bread from materials never meant to be consumed. The flour he received from German supply depots was mixed with sawdust, ground chestnuts, even powdered straw. The loaves that emerged from his ovens were dense, gray bricks that crumbled like clay and tasted of desperation. Marie reached the counter and placed her ration card on the scarred wooden surface. Leclerc glanced at it, then at her, and something like pity flickered in his tired eyes. He reached beneath the counter and produced a loaf slightly larger than regulation, sliding it across to her with the faintest nod. "For the children," he murmured. Marie's throat tightened. She wanted to thank him, to express the gratitude that swelled in her chest, but words felt inadequate. She simply nodded, wrapped the bread in a cloth and pressed it against her body as if it were something precious beyond measure, because it was. Outside, Thomas stared at the bundle with an intensity that broke her mother's heart. "Can we eat it now, Maman?" His voice was small, barely audible. "At home," Marie said gently. "We'll sit at the table, together." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The autumn wind in the Loire Valley carried the smell of rotting leaves and something else, something that had become all too familiar in the villages scattered across occupied France. It was the smell of absence. The absence of bread baking in morning ovens, the absence of meat sizzling in pans, the absence of life as it had been before the gray uniforms arrived. In the village of Saint-Rémy, a cluster of stone cottages huddled along a narrow road that wound between apple orchards now picked bare by requisition orders, the morning of October 1943 began like every other morning in the fourth year of occupation. Cold, silent, hungry. Marie Dubois stood in line outside Monsieur Leclerc's bakery, her wool coat pulled tight against the chill, though the fabric had grown so thin it offered little protection. She was 32 years old, though the mirror now showed a woman a decade older. Her cheeks, once full and flushed with the health of a farm wife, had hollowed into sharp angles. Her hands, calloused from work, trembled slightly, not from cold alone, but from the persistent weakness that hunger carves into the body. Beside her stood her daughter Isabelle, 8 years old with eyes too large for her gaunt face. The child's hair, once a cascade of chestnut curls that caught sunlight like copper, now hung limp and dull, tied back with a frayed ribbon. Her brother, Thomas, 10 years old, pressed close to her mother's other side, his thin shoulders hunched beneath a jacket that belonged to his father. Thomas and Isabelle ate slowly, their jaws working methodically at the tough bread. Marie watched them, committing every detail to memory. The way Thomas closed his eyes with each bite, as if trying to savor something that could not be savored. The way Isabelle's small hands cradled her portion as though it might vanish if she let go. When they finished, Isabelle looked up at her mother with those enormous eyes. "Maman, aren't you hungry?" Marie forced a smile. "I ate earlier, ma chérie, before you woke." It was a lie. She had not eaten earlier. She had not eaten yesterday either. But watching her children consume even this meager meal filled something in her that food could not touch. It was not sustenance, but it was survival of a different kind. The days blurred together in a monotonous rhythm of scarcity. Each morning the line at the bakery, each afternoon foraging in the fields for anything edible. Dandelion greens, wild mushrooms, berries long past their season. Each evening, the ritual of dividing whatever had been found, always ensuring the children received the lion's share. Marie learned to ignore the constant gnawing in her belly, the lightheadedness that came when she stood too quickly, the way her vision sometimes blurred at the edges. She learned to move slowly to conserve energy, to sleep when possible to escape the hunger, to drink water until her stomach felt momentarily full. But the children could not be so easily deceived. Thomas grew quieter with each passing week, his laughter a distant memory. He no longer played in the fields or chased his sister through the orchard. Instead, he sat for hours staring at nothing, his hands folded in his lap, his face expressionless. Isabelle developed a cough that rattled in her narrow chest, a wet, persistent sound that kept Marie awake at night. The village doctor, an elderly man who had stayed behind when younger physicians fled or were conscripted, examined the girl with trembling hands and a face heavy with sorrow. "Malnutrition," he said quietly, as if naming the disease might somehow lessen its power. "Her body cannot fight infection. She needs protein, vitamins, fat. She needs food, Madame Dubois." "I know," Marie whispered. "But where?" The doctor had no answer. There was no answer. The black market thrived in the shadows of occupation, a dangerous underworld where those with money or valuables could obtain what ration cards could not provide. Marie had heard whispers of eggs sold for 20 francs apiece, butter for 100, a chicken for more than a week's wages. But she had neither money nor valuables. Her wedding ring had been traded months ago for a sack of potatoes. Her mother's silver locket, the last heirloom, had bought 3 kilos of flour that lasted barely 2 weeks. Desperation makes criminals of honest people. One night, under a moonless sky, Marie crept into the orchard behind the abandoned Fontaine estate. The trees there still bore fruit, small and bitter apples that the Germans had not yet discovered. She filled her pockets and the inside of her coat, working quickly, listening for the sound of boots on gravel. She was nearly back to the road when a voice cut through the darkness. "Halt!" A flashlight beam struck her face, blinding. She froze, arms wrapped around her stolen bounty, heart hammering against her ribs.
A German soldier approached, young, perhaps 19, his rifle pointed at her chest. For a moment they stared at each other, captor and captive, and Marie waited for the inevitable. Arrest, prison, her children left alone. But the soldier's eyes dropped to her coat, bulging with apples, then to her face, gaunt and desperate. Something shifted in his expression. He lowered the rifle slightly. "Go," he said in heavily accented French. "Quickly. I did not see you." Marie did not wait for him to reconsider. She ran, clutching the apples, her breath coming in ragged gasps, tears streaming down her face. When she reached the cottage, she collapsed inside the door, the fruit spilling across the floor like treasures from a fairy tale. Thomas and Isabelle woke to the sound of their mother sobbing and laughing at once, and in the dim candlelight they gathered the apples together, a family united by the simple grace of survival. But grace was fleeting. The winter of 1943 descended with brutal efficiency, bringing snow that buried the roads and cold that seeped through every crack in the cottage walls. Firewood became as precious as food, and Marie burned what little furniture remained. The children slept together, huddled under every blanket and coat, their bodies thin and trembling. Illness swept through the village like a scythe through wheat. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza. Malnourished bodies could not fight. The church bell tolled with increasing frequency, each ring marking another life lost. Marie lived in terror that one morning she would wake to find Isabelle cold beside her, that cough finally silenced. By early 1944, the children had changed in ways that went beyond physical. Thomas rarely spoke anymore. When he did, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He moved like an old man, slow and deliberate, as if every step required consideration. Isabelle's cough had worsened, and blood sometimes flecked her handkerchief, a sight that made Marie's chest tighten with panic. The village itself seemed to be dying. Shops stood empty, their windows shattered or boarded. The school had closed. The priest, Father Bernard, held mass for congregations that grew smaller each week. Hope, that most human of emotions, had become a luxury no one could afford.
And yet, even in the depths of despair, whispers of possibility circulated. They came from the radio hidden in Madame Renard's cellar, the one she risked her life to operate each night, listening to broadcasts from London. The Allies had landed in Normandy. They were pushing inland. Liberation, once an impossible dream, was becoming a tangible reality. But liberation felt abstract to Marie. It was something happening elsewhere, in places she had only heard about. What mattered was the here and now, the bread that never stretched far enough, the children who grew weaker each day, the endless calculation of how to survive one more hour, one more day. Spring arrived with reluctant warmth, bringing with it wildflowers that bloomed in the fields and birds that sang in trees budding with new leaves. The contrast between nature's renewal and human suffering felt obscene. Marie walked through meadows carpeted in yellow and purple blossoms, searching for edible plants, and wondered if beauty itself had become a form of mockery. One afternoon in late August, she returned to the cottage to find Thomas sitting at the table, staring at his hands. Isabelle lay on the bed, her breathing shallow and labored. "Maman," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper, "when will Papa come home?" Marie set down her basket of foraged greens and knelt beside her son. She took his hands in hers, feeling how small they were, how the bones pressed against the skin with almost no flesh between. "I don't know, mon fils," she said honestly, "but we must keep hoping. Hope is what keeps us alive." Even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. Hope had not filled their bellies. Hope had not warmed them through the winter. Hope had not cured Isabelle's cough. And yet, what else was there?
That night, as Marie lay beside her children, listening to Isabelle's rattling breath and Thomas's fitful sleep, she allowed herself a moment of complete honesty. She was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of scraping together meals from nothing, tired of watching her children fade like photographs left too long in the sun. But morning would come, as it always did, and with it the need to arise, to forage, to queue at the bakery, to continue the impossible task of keeping her family alive. So she closed her eyes and willed herself to sleep, pushing away the question that haunted her most. How much longer could they endure? The answer came not in days or weeks, but in the distant rumble of engines that would soon change everything. But that morning, as Marie stood in line at the bakery clutching her ration card, she knew nothing of what was coming. She knew only hunger, fatigue, and the thin thread of determination that kept her upright. The bread Monsieur Leclerc placed in her hands that day was smaller than usual, darker, harder. She accepted it without complaint. Complaint required energy she did not have. She wrapped it carefully and turned toward home, her children trailing behind like shadows. None of them noticed the way the German soldiers in the square seemed more agitated than usual, their voices sharp with urgency. None of them heard the distant thunder that was not thunder at all, but something else entirely. Something that would arrive like a storm, breaking over the village with a force that would leave them forever changed. But in that moment, walking home with a loaf of bread that would not satisfy their hunger, Marie Dubois could not see the future. She could only place one foot in front of the other, moving through a present that felt endless, trapped in a hunger that seemed it would never end. The gray sky above promised rain. She pulled her children closer and hurried home, not knowing that within days the sound of engines would bring not fear, but something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Real, tangible, life-giving hope. But she did not know that yet. Not yet. The sound came first, before the sight. A low, steady rumble that rolled across the fields like distant thunder, but different. This was mechanical, purposeful, growing louder with each moment. Marie stood frozen in the cottage doorway, her hand gripping the weathered wood, her heart suddenly pounding with an emotion she couldn't name, something caught between fear and hope. Thomas appeared at her side, his thin face turned toward the road. "Maman, what is it?" "I don't know," she whispered, though something deep in her chest was beginning to understand. The rumble became a roar. Dust clouds rose on the horizon, swirling gold in the late morning sun. And then they appeared, vehicles unlike any the village had seen before. Not the angular, gray German trucks that had prowled these roads for 4 years, but something else entirely. Rounded, powerful machines painted in olive green, with white stars emblazoned on their sides that caught the light like beacons. "Americans!" Madame Renard gasped from across the road, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mon Dieu, the Americans have come!" The word spread through Saint-Rémy like wildfire. Windows flew open, doors burst wide open. People who had hidden for years emerged blinking into the sunlight, drawn by the sound of liberation rolling down their street. Children who had forgotten how to run suddenly found their legs, racing toward the convoy with shrieks of excitement that startled the very birds from the trees. Marie stood paralyzed. Isabelle clutched against her skirts as the first vehicles entered the village square. Soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms rode atop the trucks, their helmets rounded rather than pointed, their faces open and smiling. They waved as they passed, and the gesture was so casual, so utterly devoid of menace, that something cracked inside her chest.
One jeep slowed as it approached her cottage. A young soldier, perhaps 20 years old, with a sunburned face and bright blue eyes, leaned over the side. He pulled something from his jacket, a small brown rectangle wrapped in paper, and held it out toward Isabelle. "For you, mademoiselle," he said, in heavily accented but intelligible French. Isabelle pressed harder against her mother's legs, her eyes wide with uncertainty. The soldier smiled, his face crinkling with genuine warmth, and gestured for her to take it. Slowly, hesitantly, the little girl reached out her thin hand and accepted the offering. Marie watched as her daughter unwrapped the paper with trembling fingers. The smell hit first, sweet, rich, utterly foreign to a child who had known only deprivation. Chocolate. Real chocolate, dark and smooth, the kind that had existed only in memory for 4 long years. Isabelle broke off a small piece and placed it on her tongue. Her eyes widened, then closed. A sound escaped her throat, something between a gasp and a sob, and tears began streaming down her hollow cheeks. "Maman," she whispered, looking up with an expression of such wonder it bordered on pain. "Maman, I remember now. I remember what sweet tastes like." And Marie, who had not allowed herself to cry through all the months of starvation and fear, who had remained stone-faced through every indignity and loss, felt her own vision blur. Tears spilled hot and fast down her face, and she couldn't stop them, didn't want to stop them. She knelt beside her daughter and pulled her close, and together they wept while American trucks rumbled past, carrying with them the first real taste of freedom. Thomas stood beside them, silent, as always, but when the same soldier tossed him a stick of chewing gum, the boy caught it with both hands and held it against his chest as if it were made of gold. The convoy rolled to a stop in the village square, engines idling, creating a cacophony that should have been frightening but somehow wasn't. Soldiers dismounted, stretching stiff limbs, laughing and calling to one another in English. The villagers gathered in cautious clusters, whispering, watching, afraid to believe what their eyes were showing them. Then one soldier, a sergeant with graying hair and kind eyes, approached the growing crowd. He removed his helmet and spoke in careful, practiced French. "We are here to help. No one will hurt you anymore. The Germans are gone." The words hung in the air for a moment, too impossible to be true. Then Madame Renard, the baker's widow, who had hidden a radio in her cellar and risked her life every night to listen to BBC broadcasts, stepped forward. She reached out and touched the sergeant's sleeve as if to confirm he was real, solid, not another cruel dream. "You're really here," she breathed. "You're really here." "Yes, ma'am," the sergeant replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We're here. And we brought something for you." He turned and called orders to his men. Soldiers began unloading crates from the trucks, wooden boxes stamped with U.S. Army in bold black letters. They pried open the lids, and Marie watched in disbelief as the contents were revealed. Canned meat, powdered milk, white flour, real coffee, chocolate bars stacked like treasure, cigarettes, soap, blankets. Things that had become mythical, existing only in the memories of a world before war. Father Bernard, the village priest who had grown gaunt, presiding over too many funerals, fell to his knees in the dust and crossed himself, lips moving in silent prayer. The soldiers began distributing the supplies, and the villagers approached with a mixture of eagerness and hesitation, as if moving too quickly might shatter the illusion. Marie found herself in line. Isabelle's hand clutched in hers, Thomas pressed against her other side. When her turn came, a corporal with freckles across his nose handed her a cardboard box. "For your family, ma'am," he said in English, then added in broken French, "Pour vos enfants." Marie looked down at the contents. Canned spam, powdered eggs, a bag of white sugar, tins of condensed milk, crackers wrapped in wax paper. More food than she had seen in months, all contained in a single box that weighed heavy in her arms. "Merci," she whispered, the word utterly inadequate. "Merci, merci."
The corporal's eyes softened as he looked at her children, Thomas with his hollow cheeks and enormous eyes, Isabelle still clutching that precious chocolate bar. He reached into his pack and pulled out 2 more candy bars and pressed them into the children's hands. "For later," he said with a wink that transcended language. Marie carried the box home as if it contained something sacred. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped it twice. Inside the cottage, she set it on the table and simply stared, unable to process what she was seeing. Thomas broke the silence. "Maman, is it real? Can we really eat it?" "Yes, mon fils," Marie said, her voice cracking. "Yes, we can eat." She opened the can of Spam with a knife, the blade cutting through the metal lid with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. The smell that emerged made her dizzy, rich, salty, meaty. She had forgotten that food could smell like this. She cut 3 slices, placing them on the chipped plates that were all they had left. Thomas and Isabelle stared at the portions as if they might vanish. "Eat slowly," Marie instructed, though her own hands trembled with the urge to devour everything at once. Thomas took the first bite. His jaw worked slowly, his eyes closing in concentration. Then his face crumpled, and he began to cry. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook his thin shoulders. "It's so good, Mama. It's so good, I can't stand it."
Isabelle ate her portion with the same reverence one might approach communion. Each bite was measured, savored, as if she were memorizing the experience. When she finished, she licked the grease from her fingers and looked at her mother with eyes that held something they hadn't held in years: joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Marie ate her own portion slowly, each mouthful an explosion of flavor after months of sawdust bread and nettle soup. The fat coated her tongue, the salt sang on her taste buds, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, her stomach felt satisfied. That night, for the first time in years, Marie's children went to bed with full bellies. Isabelle's cough seemed quieter, or perhaps that was wishful thinking. Thomas slept deeply, without the fitful tossing that had become his norm, and Marie sat at the table with a cup of real coffee, bitter, strong, perfect, and allowed herself to believe that survival was no longer the only option. The next morning, the square had transformed. American soldiers had erected field kitchens overnight, massive metal structures with smoking chimneys and bubbling cauldrons. The smell that wafted through the village was intoxicating: stew thick with vegetables and chunks of meat, bread baking in portable ovens, coffee brewing in quantities that seemed impossible. Villagers gathered hesitantly, unsure if they were truly welcome. Then a cook, a large man with a booming laugh, began ladling stew into any container offered. Bowls, cups, even hats became vessels for hot, nourishing food. Marie stood in line with dozens of others, her children pressed close. When she reached the front, the cook filled her bowl to overflowing, chunks of carrot and potato and actual beef floating in rich brown gravy. "Bon appétit, madame," he said with a grin that split his face. They ate sitting on the stone steps of the church, steam rising from their bowls in the cool morning air. The stew was thick enough that a spoon could stand upright in it. The meat fell apart at the gentlest touch. The vegetables were soft, but not mushy, seasoned with herbs that Marie had forgotten existed. Isabelle ate 3 full bowls, her small stomach distending visibly. Thomas ate 4, pausing only to breathe. Marie forced herself to eat slowly, though her body screamed for more. Years of deprivation had taught her caution. Too much food too quickly could make a starved person violently ill. Around them, the same scene played out repeatedly. Children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs devouring American Army rations. Mothers crying openly as they watched their families eat real food. Old men eating stew with trembling hands, tears streaming into their beards. One elderly woman, Madame Colette, who had lost 3 sons to the war, sat beside Marie and ate her stew in silence.
When she finished, she set down her bowl and spoke in a voice thick with emotion. "I thought I would die without tasting meat again. I made my peace with it. And now this. These strangers who owe us nothing have given us everything." Marie reached over and squeezed the old woman's hand. No words were necessary. Over the following days, the American presence in Saint-Rémy became normalized, though the abundance they brought never ceased to amaze. Supplied trucks arrived daily, unloading more food than the village could consume. Soldiers shared cigarettes with Frenchmen who hadn't smoked tobacco in years. They handed out chocolate to every child they passed. They set up medical tents where army doctors treated malnutrition, disease, and injuries that had gone untended for years. Dr. Moreau, the village physician, worked alongside the American medics, his eyes constantly misting with gratitude. "They have antibiotics," he told Marie when she brought Isabelle for examination. "Real medicine. I can actually heal people now, not just watch them die." Marie wept in the medical tent, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking. The doctor patted her shoulder awkwardly, unaccustomed to such displays, but understanding them completely. Thomas, too, began to change. With regular meals, his energy slowly returned. He started playing again, tentatively at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. One afternoon, Marie watched from the cottage window as he kicked a ball made of rags with other village boys, and the sound of their laughter, high and clear and unburdened, made her chest ache with relief. The transformation wasn't only physical. Something deeper was shifting in the village. People who moved like ghosts began to walk with purpose. Conversations grew louder, more animated. Laughter, that most human of sounds that had been suppressed for so long, began to ring out freely. One evening, the Americans organized a gathering in the square. They set up long tables and benches, hanging lanterns from tree branches. Field kitchens produced a feast: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and dessert, actual cake with white frosting. The villagers came dressed in their best remaining clothes, which were still shabby by any measure, but there was an effort made, a return to dignity. They sat alongside soldiers at the long tables, and though language remained a barrier, smiles and gestures bridged the gap. A soldier produced a harmonica and began to play, first American songs that the villagers didn't recognize, then, to everyone's surprise, La Marseillaise, the French national anthem, forbidden under occupation, now played openly in the village square.
As the first notes sounded, Father Bernard stood, followed by every French citizen present. They sang with voices rusty from disuse, but growing stronger with each verse, tears streaming down weathered faces. The American soldiers stood as well, hands over hearts, honoring an anthem that wasn't theirs, but respecting what it represented. Marie sang with her children pressed against her sides, her voice cracking on the high notes, and felt something inside her that had been clenched tight for 4 years finally release. After dinner, someone produced a violin. Music filled the square, first solemn and slow, then gradually faster, livelier. Couples began to dance, awkward at first, then with increasing confidence. American soldiers danced with French girls, their movements clumsy but joyful. Children spun in circles, dizzy with sugar and excitement. Thomas approached his mother with a serious expression and held out his hand. "Will you dance, maman?" Marie looked at her son, still thin but no longer skeletal, his eyes bright rather than hollow, and felt her heart swell. She took his hand and let him lead her in a simple waltz, his steps uncertain but determined. "Papa would be proud of you," she whispered. Thomas nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. "When he comes home, everything will be better now, won't it, maman?" Marie didn't have the heart to tell him that his father was likely dead, that men who disappeared into German camps rarely returned. Instead, she held him closer and said, "Yes, mon fils, everything will be better now." As the evening wore on, Marie found herself in conversation with Sergeant Mitchell, the gray-haired man who had first addressed the village.
His French was improving with practice, and her English was non-existent, but somehow they managed. "Your children, they are well?" he asked, gesturing toward Thomas and Isabelle, who were chasing fireflies with other children in the gathering darkness. "Thanks to you, yes," Marie replied. "You have given us life. I don't know how to thank you." Mitchell shook his head. "We're just doing our job, ma'am, but I'll tell you something." He paused, searching for words. "Feeding your kids, seeing them smile again, that matters more than any battle we've fought. That's what we're fighting for, so you can raise your children in peace." Marie studied his face in the lantern light, the lines around his eyes, the weariness that no amount of rest could fully erase. This man had seen terrible things, had perhaps done terrible things in the name of war. Yet here he sat, speaking with genuine emotion about the importance of feeding hungry children. "What is your family like in America?" Mitchell softened his face. He pulled a worn photograph from his wallet, a woman with a kind face and 2 children, a boy and a girl. "My wife, Sarah, my kids, Bobby and Anne. Bobby's about your son's age." Marie looked at the photo, at this intact family half a world away, and understood something fundamental. These soldiers weren't saints or saviors. They were fathers and sons and brothers who had left their own families behind to ensure that families like hers could survive. "You must miss them terribly," she said softly. "Every day," Mitchell admitted. "But I think about why I'm here, so Bobby and Anne never have to live like your kids have lived, so no mother anywhere has to watch her children starve." The music continued, the dancing went on, and gradually the gathering wound down. Soldiers retreated to their camps, and villagers returned to their homes, full-bellied and tired in a good way. Marie tucked her children into bed, their faces peaceful in sleep, their breathing steady and strong. She stood at the window, looking out at the village bathed in moonlight, and marveled at how quickly the world could change. A week ago, she had been preparing herself for the possibility that Isabelle might not survive. She had been rationing crumbs, boiling nettles, wondering which possession she could trade next for a handful of flour. She had been living in a gray world where hope was a luxury and survival was everything. Now her cupboard held canned goods. Her children's cheeks were filling out. The sound of laughter echoed through the village streets. The future, which had seemed like a door permanently sealed, had cracked open to reveal possibilities. And yet, Marie knew this abundance wasn't permanent. The Americans would eventually move on, chasing the war eastward. The Red Ball Express couldn't supply a single village forever. What they had given was a bridge, precious time for France to heal, to rebuild, to remember how to feed itself. But in this moment, standing in her small cottage with her children sleeping soundly, Marie allowed herself to believe in tomorrow. Not just survival, but life. Not just endurance, but joy. She thought of the chocolate bar Isabelle had received that first day, how she had made it last an entire week, breaking off one small square each evening and letting it melt slowly on her tongue. She thought of Thomas giving half his bread to another child yesterday, his small act of generosity mirroring the generosity that had saved them all. The Americans had brought more than food. They had brought the possibility of being human again, of thinking beyond the next meal, of caring for more than just one's own survival. Connection, Marie realized, was as essential as bread. The isolation of occupation had been almost as deadly as the hunger. To be seen, to be helped, to be treated with dignity, these things nourished the spirit as surely as food nourished the body.
Outside, an American convoy rumbled past on the road, heading east toward battles yet to be fought. Marie listened to the engines fade into the distance, carrying with them young men who might never see their own families again, and she understood that liberation had been purchased at tremendous cost. The price of her children's full bellies was measured in the blood of soldiers who died on beaches and in fields, who fell in forests and burned in tanks. Freedom, she realized, was never free. Someone always paid. She closed her eyes and made a silent vow to honor that sacrifice, to raise her children to remember, to teach them that the chocolate bars and canned meat were more than gifts. They were symbols of humanity's capacity for compassion, even in the midst of horror. The moonlight painted silver lines across the floor, and in the distance a rooster crowed prematurely, eager for dawn. Marie climbed into bed beside her children, feeling their warmth, listening to their steady breathing, and for the first time in 4 years, she allowed herself to dream of a future that extended beyond tomorrow. Maybe Henri would come home. Maybe he was alive in some distant camp, dreaming of this moment just as she had dreamed it. Maybe one day they would sit together at this table, their children laughing between them, and remember the autumn when American soldiers rolled into Saint-Rémy and gave them back their lives. Or maybe Henri was gone forever, and she would raise their children alone, teaching them to be strong and kind and grateful. Either way, they would survive. More than survive, they would live. The village of Saint-Rémy slept that night with full stomachs and lighter hearts. And though the war continued to rage across Europe, though tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, in that moment, they had something precious and rare. They had hope. Real, tangible, sustaining hope. The kind you could taste in chocolate and smell in fresh bread. The kind that came not from empty promises, but from concrete action. From strangers who crossed an ocean to ensure that children could eat and mothers could stop counting crumbs. Marie drifted toward sleep with one final thought. Connection is survival. Generosity is strength. And sometimes, salvation arrives in olive green trucks driven by young men who smile as they hand out chocolate bars to children who have forgotten what sweetness tastes like. The war would end. The soldiers would go home. But this moment, this transformation from despair to hope, from starvation to sustenance, from isolation to connection, would remain forever etched in the memory of everyone who lived it. And perhaps that was the real victory, not just defeating an enemy, but preserving humanity, not just winning battles, but feeding children, not just liberating territory, but restoring dignity. Marie slept and dreamed of bread.